Welcome to Hexapodcast, brief discussions about insects and entomologists with your hosts, John Steyerman and Lee Dyer.
Okay, welcome everyone. Hey, John Steyerman.
Hi, Lee Dyer. How's it going?
Okay, I wanted to actually first ask you if you like poetry.
Yeah, I like poetry. Sure. I don't probably read as much as I probably would like, but I enjoy it.
Well, you probably know I got my undergrad degree in English and also another one in biochemistry, but I actually published poetry. I was really into poetry, and I haven't written any poetry in a long time. I'm reading this really cool book. But it's kind of a partial apocalypse, and like most of the world is flooded because there's this nuclear war. But it's all about this sonnet. It's a bunch of sonnets put together, and this guy had read it at this special occasion, and there was no record of it anywhere. But this is the future, and they have records of everything, including all the emails anybody ever wrote that were encrypted and everything. It's all unencrypted, but it's all about the impact that it had. It made me think a little bit about how at events for our university, I'm a big fan of just making up limericks on the spot. When I introduce speakers, I'll do it. People will put me on the spot and say, hey, make up a limerick, and I'll do it. And they're pretty bad.
I imagine they're pretty bad.
Limericks are supposed to be bad, though. That's the point.
Right.
So I hope you don't mind, but I decided I'm going to make up a limerick to start our show today. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
There once were male katydid greens who courted their mates with cuisines. A spermatophore treat, both tasty and sweet, she dined while they passed on their genes.
Okay. That's pretty good. No, that's not. You should do that like every lecture. You should have a limerick to start out your lecture. Memorization exercise.
Yeah, could work. I don't know. All right, so we're going to do a game show format.
Okay, all you Hexapodcast fans, we have a special game show edition for you today. It's not Let's Make a Deal or Wheel of Fortune or anything. It's just a simple say everything you know about this topic for only 2 minutes game show with Dyer and Steyerman as the hapless contestants.
You agreed to this beforehand. That's the only thing we've done to prepare, right?
Lee, you always cut this out, but I always want to remind anybody that's listening to this that neither of us have prepared at all, and we're probably going to say lots of things that are wrong.
Incorrect. Surprisingly, we don't make that many mistakes, and some things are open for debate anyway.
The female praying mantis devours the male while they are mating. The male sometimes continues copulating even after the female has bitten off his head and part of his upper torso.
We're going to just be telling reproductive stories, which I love to do. There's this book, I don't know if you've seen it. It's Dr. Tatiana's Sex Advice.
Oh, I've heard about that. I always wanted to get that book because I heard about it. Yeah.
It's a really good book. Anyway, let's start this game show. Let's get Dwight, our game show MC, in here.
Dyer. Female reproductive system. 2 minutes. Go.
Okay, so we'll start with the females. All right, so they have paired ovaries, they have accessory glands, they've got a spermatheca, not always, but typically they have a spermatheca, which is one of my favorite parts. They have a spermathecal gland, typically that goes with that. They've got a gonopore, they've got modified 8th and 9th abdominal segments that often form an ovipositor. They have either a vagina or bursicopulatrix or both. They have some kind of genital chamber that is more anterior to the opening to the vulva of the female reproductive system. So one of my favorite parts, though, is the spermatheca, because so I spend a lot of time talking about the ovary, but right now I'll just mention that the spermatheca I really think is pretty fascinating because it is where sperm is stored. So if you're like a queen ant, for example, and you go through on your nuptial flight, you'll pack that spermatheca with a bunch of sperm from hundreds of males that are flying in that nuptial flight. And then that's it. That's all the sperm that you have for the rest of your life as the queen. And so the queen can decide whether or not to fertilize an egg because they have haplodiploidy, and a haploid unfertilized egg becomes a male and a fertilized egg becomes a female. Okay, so I have no idea how much time I have left, but I'll just say that one of my PhD students worked on describing new species of this moth in the genus Eoas, and she was looking at how diverse the female genitalia are, whereas typically taxonomists have focused on the male genitalia and the diversity of adiagus or penis or other external parts of the male reproductive system. So let's talk.
Diamond, was everything okay about this? Anything to add, Styrman?
So everything you said sounded correct. I mean, you didn't really talk about the ovarioles, and then the oviducts, and how the eggs, so they acquire yolk and stuff like that, and then move down to the oviducts into a chamber where typically the spermatheca feeds into, so they can be fertilized, right? And then sometimes they're laid directly after they're fertilized. Many insects, or some insects can, have a uterus where they can hold those eggs and they can undergo some embryonic development before they're laid. But that spermatheca, I agree, it's really cool because we think about humans and basically fertilization happens right after copulation or very, very soon after copulation. But like you said, all insects have spermatheca, so the female can store sperm, and not just from one male, right? You mentioned, or I don't know if you mentioned, but they can store sperm from multiple males, and then I don't know, there's some mechanisms of sperm discrimination, but I don't know like how they do that, where they can, to some extent, favor sperm from some males they've mated with over other males. But I think, so the spermatheca is one of my favorite parts of the female reproductive system, but the accessory glands are at least as cool and important because they produce all this stuff, like a huge diversity of chemicals that are used for all kinds of things, glues to glue eggs on surfaces, protective stuff to put on eggs, pheromones to ward off other females from laying eggs where they've laid. I'm just like scratching the surface of all the different things, ootheca of like the Dictyopterans.
Oh, looks like your time's up, Starman.
That's bad.
I'm sorry, Chef.
And when I say bad, I mean Michael Jackson bad.
Thank you, Chef.
You know how he looked really, really bad at the end of his life?
I totally agree. I totally screwed up by not mentioning the accessory glands. I spent a lot of time talking about that in like the mantid oothecum and the oothecum of the cockroach.
Enough of that. Let's move on. Dyer, male reproductive system. 2 minutes. Go.
So the male reproductive system. So there's paired gonads, like in the female, they have the testes. Then there's these systems of tubes, vas deferens, seminal vesicle. Sometimes I think the seminal vesicle is even expanded and kind of convoluted as sort of like an epididymis, like invertebrates. And there are accessory glands, like you mentioned, for the females. Then there's an ejaculatory duct. There's the adiagus, which has so many different names. The adiagus could be the penis. The adiagus could be a certain part of the penis, depending on what taxon you're working with. And then, of course, more distally is the gonopore. So I won't talk much about the testes because I didn't talk much about the ovaries or any of the ducts or anything. I think for me, the most interesting thing that I missed on the female are the accessory glands, right? So the accessory glands produce the seminal fluid. They have all kinds of chemicals that can react with the female reproductive system. So it can cause these contractions that have the females actually ovulate, so release eggs into the tubes of the female system so that they can be more likely to fertilize an egg rather than going to the spermatheca, where then the female kind of has more control over what fertilizes the egg. So the other thing that's cool is I think that these accessory glands, or you could call them accessory glands, are responsible for producing these things that I'll mention in one of my stories that I'm allowed to tell. These things like stink plugs that heliconines that these butterflies produce, where they actually plug up the bursa copulatrix or the vagina. Okay. So at least I got the word stink plug in there.
You're trying to say a lot in 2 minutes, but
it's great.
No, I think okay, yeah.
Okay, you ready?
Anything to add, Styrman?
So, I think you explained it pretty well. As with the female, I think the male reproductive, one of the most interesting things of the male reproductive system are those accessory glands, just because they produce so many diverse things for different functions. And yeah, in the male's case, a lot of it, I mean, it's kind of seminal fluid, whatever, but also all kinds of chemicals to enhance their sperm being the ones that fertilize eggs. There's aphrodisiacs and all sorts of things. And then maybe we should say somewhere that, like, what we know is based on a relatively small number of insects. Like, they're doing probably all kinds of super interesting things. All the cool stories we're going to tell you are based on what's been found out so far, but for 95% of insects, we don't know like what they do. Probably, I mean, more or less. So anyway, but the phallus or the adiagus, I say phallus just as a general term for the intromittent organ. The phalli and the accessory structures of the phallus are super interesting and diverse in insects, and there's been incredible morphological innovation, and we, for the most part, don't know like why they have these complex penises with all kinds of bells and whistles and ticklers and structures on them.
And so, by dividing the weight and the girth of the penis by the angle, or the, what do we call it again? The yaw of the shaft, what we finally get is the adjusted penis size, or TMI.
It does appear in many cases that the phallus evolves way faster than other morphology. That's why like people like dissect genitalia to identify species, because especially in males, probably in females too, but it's just harder to see the diversity of structure in the internal organs of females versus males.
Hey man, Lee Dyer, hey man. What'd you think of all that, man? Did Steyerman get it right?
We both should have spent more time on how much has been put into describing the male genitalia. And there's these special devices, the phalloblaster, and all these things to extend the phallus or the adiagus. And some of these things are just amazing. All these structures and the drawings that people and the micrographs that people create. That's what I was saying about the female reproductive system. Is my student who worked on the Yoas taxonomy felt like it was biased towards males, and she had this 100-character matrix. I think about 25 of them were just female reproductive parts. I mean, there was wing parts and, all these other things. And then about 25 of them were male reproductive parts. Okay, so are you ready?
Oh, wait, we're still doing this?
Well, now we're going to do stories about insect reproduction. We kind of did a really crude introduction to all their parts.
Enough of insect reproductive parts, and no more of that Oingo Boingo song about insect sex and dance. Let's move on. Dyer, give us a story about male choice and male investment via the spermatophore. 2 minutes. Go.
The story that I like to tell is one that I have not been able to find any literature to back up. But it was a story that I heard when I was a graduate student, and I knew nothing about insects. I took my first entomology class as a graduate student, and I took this class from Jeff Minton on population genetics, which I was full on into population genetics. That's what I loved as a graduate student. I read everything by Solwright and Fisher and Haldane, and I know I'm wasting my time not telling the story, but I took this class from Jeff Minton, and he told this story about how insects, when they reproduce, typically the female chooses her mate because her investment in reproduction is far greater. He taught us a little bit about the spermatophore that the males produce, and he talked about this beetle that produces such a massive spermatophore that it loses 20% of its mass after reproduction. So in this case, the male actually chooses. So the male sits around releasing some kind of pheromone and waits for a female to land on his elytra, and that's his ventral side, that's his back, so to speak. And then he does a bunch of push-ups. And if she's not heavy enough, he kicks her off because he wants a good mother for his offspring. And he's contributing a lot to this with his huge spermatophore. So this is a really cool example of male choice, but I've never been able to find. I actually asked an AI if it knew of any references, and it didn't. And it's like, so here's some search terms you can use, but I have not been able to find out what does this. Okay, that was it.
Steyerman, was everything okay about
I just want to say that I've heard that I think it was a cricket, maybe like a enciferan or whatever, like Mormon crickets or whatever, that they do that because Orthoptera are well known for these big spermatophores, and spermatophores are this structure that contains like the sperm, but also contains usually some kind of like nutritive, lipids or protein that the female often eats.
Yep, you can tell about that in your 2 minutes.
Anyway, but I heard I heard the same story, but I thought it was an orthopteran.
Okay, boys, let's move on. Dr. Steierman, could you please spend 2 minutes telling a story about a female with a penis?
One really interesting is the cave Socoптron that I'm sure you've heard of this one, where there are little bark lice that live in caves, and I can't remember how they attract mates, but anyway, it's the only case in the whole animal kingdom that I know of where females actually have the intromittent organ. So females have a penis and they insert it into the male.
Well, hey there, darling, have you heard the news today?
Tell me something new now, honey. Make my funky day.
Bark lice, oh bark lice, you are so cool. The females insert their penises into the males.
Bark lice, oh bark lice, you are so cool. The females insert their penises into the males.
And basically suck up their sperm. I can't remember if there could be a spermatophore involved there, so they could be like sticking it in there and sucking out like this spermatophore. There's like kind of X-ray pictures showing like the female's like structure going into the male, basically into his gonopore. And I can't remember. That's a problem. I should have done some research. I can't remember exactly like why females have the penises in this case, or the phalluses. I think it is a case in which males are the choosier sex and they invest something, but I can't remember if that was spermatophores or not. But anyway, the only case that I've ever heard of where females have the penises. I mean, as a rule.
Okay.
Did Steierman get it right? Or are we off just a little tonight? Tell us what you think, Dyer Man.
Yeah, I actually don't really have anything to add. I will say that they're hermaphrodites, like some scales, right? They have. So that's kind of, you could sort of argue that, well, here's a female with penis because it's a hermaphrodite.
Well, but it's,
or no.
The males don't have penises, so it's a little different.
All right. That was a super cool story and a new one for me. I'll have to use it from now on in entomology.
Okay. On with our thrilling game show. Here is another one for Dr. Steierman. Tell us a story that is related to sperm precedence in the spermatheca, please. In 2 minutes, of course.
You haven't brought this up, and this is one of the classic cool examples of, I guess, intrasexual selection in insects are the damselflies and dragonflies, particularly the damselflies. They have secondary genitalia. They transfer their sperm from their primary genitalia to secondary genitalia, and that's what they actually copulate with. And as you mentioned, insects can store sperm, and they can store sperm with multiple males. And what these damselflies do is they have these specialized structures on their secondary penises, their phalluses, to either like scoop out the sperm of males from a previous mating, or sort of pack it in the end of the spermatheca so that those sperm are less likely to fertilize the eggs and then deposit their sperm, so that their sperm are more likely. And I don't know if this has been known for decades, and there's like famous pictures of these various secondary genitalia phalluses with like sperm on them where they scooped out the previous male's sperm.
Halfway through the copulation, the male,
before he actually does the act,
is actually removing his penis from the female, and it's covered with sperm from the previous male that inseminated that female.
It probably has been studied in detail across the odonates, and I'm not sure if they all do it or just some of them do it. Because they can store sperm, there's all these kind of cool like post-mating kinds of strategies that males can do to try to like make sure that their sperm are the ones that fertilize the females. And part of that is sperm scoopers. And they've probably been identified in other groups of insects aside from odonates, but I'm not sure where else.
Good job.
Hey man, Lee Dyer, hey man. What you think of all that, man?
Yeah, so the only thing I have to say about that is something that I love to talk about. And I think the whole sperm precedence has yielded these crazy things, including one that I'm not going to talk about. And it's this beetle that has a phallus that's shaped like a medieval weapon of mace, and it actually damages the female so that she releases her egg right away, and his sperm will fertilize the egg. And they have these micrographs of everything. It's really cool.
Can we move on, please? I would like Dr. Dyer to tell a story about how male and female insects find each other in order to mate. Can you do that in 2 minutes without any silly limericks or other distractions?
Okay, so this one, I'm going to actually come up with a limerick for this one, and see. And I'm going to see if you can tell me after my 2 minutes are up if you know what the limerick is about. If you knew when I said it. So there once was a Photurus firefly so bright, who mimicked Photinus firefly male's light. She lured him in near, then made him disappear and stole all his toxins that night. So this is about beetles, fireflies. And this is Tom Eisner's work, so I have to talk about this because I do chemical ecology. And these males flash these lights that are unique to their species, and then the females are on the ground and they flash back, and then the males come in and they mate. And so this is one where the females of Photurus genus, I think, they figured out the signal of the Photinus, this other genus, and so when the males are flashing, they'll flash, and the Photinus comes in, and then they'll kill them and eat them. And the other genus has more secondary metabolite defenses, so they eat them and they sequester these defenses, and they get sort of this defense from. And Tom Eisner called them femme fatales. So it's one of my favorite stories because it's got chemistry, it's got deception, and it's this kind of thing is not as common, although signaling for reproduction does lure in predators and parasites, and that's something we talked about with Amy. That's all I have to say about this.
Steyerman, was everything okay about this? Anything to add, Steyerman? Was everything good, or do you need to fix all the things that Dyer tried to say?
You mentioned sperm precedence, and I want to say something about that we usually think, like in mammals maybe, but actually lots of mammals can store sperm, like bats and like otters, I think, can store sperm. Anyway, things like us, where we don't store sperm, it's like you want to be the first one to mate with a female. You don't want to be the second or third or fourth male to mate with the female, because that first male is the one that probably is going to fertilize the eggs, right? But in insects, it's the opposite. Typically, it's the last male, the last one into the spermatheca is the first one out. So you don't want to be the first male, you want to be the last male to mate with that female. So when she lets sperm out of the spermatheca to fertilize those eggs as they move down the oviduct, it's your sperm.
He squints and he focuses, and he can see all these wriggling things. It is just full, absolutely full of these tiny eel-like things. He says a vast number of living animalcules.
Animalcules?
Their bodies were rounded and furnished with a long, thin tail.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode on sperm competition in the spermatheca and elsewhere.
Oh, you mean like the sperm is competing?
The sperm is competing.
Not just the makers of the sperm, but the sperm itself.
The sperm itself.
Okay, let's continue with the game here.
We have arrived at the last 2-minute story. Dr. Steyerman, let's hear a smashing good story about nuptial gifts. And please, try not to talk about dreadful flies. Ready?
We haven't talked about flies, sex and flies, and so, balloon flies. So the empidids, there's this cool thing. Nuptial gifts are a big thing in insects. Lots of insects give, like males will go catch prey or gather resources and offer it to the female, and the female will kind of judge how good that gift is, and sometimes they'll eat it while the male's mating, and they'll eat, and the male can mate as long as that food lasts, and then she kicks him off. So the bigger the reward, the better. And so a lot of flies do this, particularly the empidoids. And some of the empids, the balloon flies, they capture prey, like little flies, and they wrap them in a silk balloon that they produce, and then they kind of fly around with this balloon saying, "Hey, look, here's my, my gift, my nuptial gift." But there's kind of, it's interesting because some species, they've kind of done away with the nuptial gift and they just make a silk balloon and they wave that around, and it's gone from like an actual resource to just a signal of mating. And I don't know if am I running out of time? Oh, good. So there's this really interesting progression from, like, first they just give a gift, then some of them wrap it in silk and they offer it to the females, and then some of them, I think they have like a bug stuck on the outside of their silk balloon, and then some species just have these silk balloons, and then it's become a purely non-resource based thing, but just purely a signal, perhaps taking advantage of sensory bias in females. If I don't know if you've, well, yeah, we haven't talked about sexual selection and all the different, Fisher's runaway sexual selection, genes, and all those sorts of things.
Tell us what you think, Dyer man. Let it out right now, man.
Okay, I just have one thing to say about that. There once was a fly with a flare who wrapped up a gift with great care, a prey item so neat to make mating so sweet, though sometimes the wrapping was air.
That's really good. Like, you're coming up with those like on the spot.
It's my thing, man. I was a poet.
That was good.
It's a little bit funny.
I wonder how common any of this stuff is across the whole insect phylogeny.
It just comes from a small fraction of insects. And so all the amazing stories and the diversity that we might talk about, there's way more out there, right? This is just the tip of the iceberg.
I love this comment that you've made several times, and I can't really make fun of you for making this comment many times, because in my entomology lectures, I have this slide that I must have it in 100 times, and it's 20 model species of insects. And I have the number of hits, like citation hits from the Web of Science, and they keep growing. Number one is Drosophila melanogaster, right? And everything we knew about the brain was from that. But if you go beyond those 20, if you find a recent paper on something you've never heard of, and you see how many hits that gets, it's like 10. And so you're right. I think everything we know about insects is from about 20 species and that are in about 10 orders. And that's it. So I agree. There's so much to learn, but it's one of those sad things that we're losing so many species, that many, many stories that we're going to lose, like of the beetle doing push-ups, or the dragonfly scooping sperm out so they can get their sperm in there.
Let's find out the truth. You are not the father.
I actually did not grow up with television. I never saw game shows, but I know enough about American culture, or whatever you want to call it, that I kind of know about game shows. There's these game show things that pop up everywhere outside of actually watching one on TV, which I've never done.
And now, here is the host of Jeopardy, Alex Trebek.
Well, I actually have like a Jeopardy template, PowerPoint Jeopardy thing that I sometimes, as that kind of review for entomology, and I have teams, and then I give them like prizes like stickers, and the students love it. They they have a great time.
That's really cool, man. It sounds a lot like the Linnaean games at the Entomological Society of America. What do you know about those?
The Linnaean games are held at the entomology meetings. There are teams from different universities, colleges that like practice. There's a coach usually, and then they compete. Basically, they have to answer questions in a sort of Jeopardy style format in front of everybody up on a stage.
Come on down! Teresa! Ashley! Come on down!
No, it's like Family Feud. They can kind of talk amongst themselves.
All right, let's stop there with that excellent description of the Linnaean games.
This is Hexapodcast.
Thanks again to all you insect lovers for listening to Hexapodcast.
We'll right by your side. Hold on to the end of the line. Lay with you while the night is still. Proves you haven't lost your will. Soon the road will be clear, the days only go up from here.